Hello. Not sure if we're actually live yet. I'm getting a weird notification. I'll just wait for everything to catch up. All right. I think we are. All right. I think we're live now. Well, maybe not. I don't know. Everything seems to not be working. Well, I'm just going to full steam ahead and it'll catch up eventually, right? All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the show. Let's see who we have in the chat so far. We have Chavez Head, Perry Stark, SH, Andrew Kang, Squid Monkey, Michael J, Captain Mac 82, Hugh Galbraith, Ting Ting, Tada, BS in California, Tim Allen, John Morgan, Kevin Lewis, Sab 1 through 0 ASDF, Nomad 0036, Leonidas Alberia, Talisman. Let's see. Jameson Wilfon, Blue River Cat, Michael Walford, Tim Dasinger. Try not to say anybody twice. Aaron Miller, Gun Websites. Let me scroll down. We have a super chat from Jason J. It says, "Hey doll, enjoy your Labor Day weekend." Thank you. Eric the Mind Control Guy, Scottish Pride, Jonathan Peterson, Schnoz, Fine Ape, Robin, Jonathan Peterson, Matthew Beverly, let's see, Rabid Taz, Gecko, Shadow Bear, and we have our intro from Trashman. Live from the storm-free state, it's the lady who is more honest than a Seki presser, more coherent than a Biden speech, and is just plain amazed that the press is critical of a Dem admin. And with that, here's Dolly. I am, in fact, surprised that some of the media is actually critical of the Biden administration, though I'm not sure about more coherent than a Biden speech currently. I feeling kind of under the weather today, and my brain isn't working quite properly. I think it's just not getting enough sleep while we had company, and it haven't been able to catch up yet. We also have James Manos in the house, Snowflakes Nightmare. Carrie Nethers is in from Facebook. David Neal, Jason Arnold, Deploribus Unum, Tango Chaser, Walter McPherson, Douglas from Pennsylvania, Edward Wooden, Tristan Goodrich, Kevin Lewis, might have said you already, Caleb R., Jared Robinson, John Sullivan, Serial Child 1, Armed for Defense, Andy, hi Andy, Patrick Murphy, Jaminica Jet, got notification from Facebook. Wow, you fancy. Dave Simmons, Michael Slack, Art Grote, Stuart Ulseth, Enjoy Nature, Jesse Meek, Benny Heim, Old Guy Disc Golf. Oh, a disc golfer. Hello, friend. Dewdrop, Carolyn Peterson, Frosty, Leprechaun, Aaron Miller. Thank you very much for the donation. And Karen Ethers also got a notification from both, but for some reason YouTube is not working for them. Interesting. Don't need to know says pregnancy memory. That's already a problem. Ting Ting says you have a month-old baby bump. Trust me, your days are going to get more strange in the future. Oh, it's more than a month. Third trimester is right around the corner at this point, which is pretty crazy. Also pretty crazy is all of the stories that we have coming out of Australia. At this point, Australia is the gift that just keeps on giving, I suppose. I thought it was bad last week. Well, already we had the reports that New Zealand shut down over one COVID case. Australia shut down over, I don't know, I don't even know what it was. So it depended on the city and the state, but there was a couple that shut down over one case. There was a couple that shut down over 100 cases. And the current status of things, we've mentioned it before, they have called in the military to enforce their lockdowns. There was this fellow that tested positive and he was told to go quarantine at a certain hotel, and they had surveillance footage of him like coughing or sneezing in an elevator, and they dispatched a warrant for him and sent the police after him and a SWAT team and all of this. And they did this whole crazy campaign of looking for this guy. And in the end, he was found in the hotel he was told to quarantine in. But the fact remains that they put out a warrant for this guy for coughing and sneezing in a public elevator while testing positive for COVID. Pretty crazy. And then we had the story, the video that I did last week, of how even though rescues and dog shelters are allowed to be open and the workers and volunteers for those programs and organizations are allowed to travel despite travel restrictions in Australia, the local government council decided to shoot 15 dogs instead, including 10 puppies that were slated to be rescued, because they decided that they didn't want anyone from out of their community traveling to actually go rescue these dogs. And so they shot them to prevent people from traveling. All of that was bad enough, but now we have this cybercrime bill that just got rammed through, which will allow law enforcement to log into your social media and actively spy on you and delete things, and I suppose hypothetically plant evidence. And the alleged goal of this is to cut back on cybercrime and cyberbullying and make sure that people are behaving properly on social media. We have these new vaccine passport things that they're trying out with this app with geolocation and facial recognition software that basically the government's going to check in on you and you have a certain amount of time to respond and prove you are where you're supposed to be, or else they send the police after you. We have hundreds of people being arrested for protesting the lockdowns. We have lockdowns being extended through September, even though, wow, cases are continuing to rise. So obviously things aren't working. There's this new quarantine camp that they're working on. There's all kinds of crazy, crazy stuff going on in Australia. And outside of Australia, there's rumors now that Pfizer is working on a twice daily COVID pill that people would be required to take to try to stave off COVID. All kinds of crazy stuff going on. Oh, yes. And John Morgan points this out as well. There has been a suspected terrorist attack in New Zealand because there was this big stabbing spree that happened earlier this week. It's just Australia is nuts right now. So let's see. Let's jump right into this. So first, I have a little news clip for you guys about the actual surveillance bill. And then we're going to go into some articles about it. Let me make sure that I have them in the right order here. All right. I believe this. There we go. Okay. Cool. So let's do this. All right, so this is a little video from Instagram, but it is a news clip out of Australia. So let's see if I can get this.
A radical plan to crack down on social media abuse is being considered by the federal government. For more, Nine's Oliver Haig joins us live in Adelaide. Ollie, how will it work?
Lila, good morning. Essentially, it will work the same as a passport. Australians forced to submit 100 points of identification, like their driver's license or passport, when using social media accounts like Facebook and Twitter. Now, police would have access to those social media accounts, and it's all part of a crackdown on online abuse. Now, users could be liable for defamation suits or even criminal prosecution, and it's all part of a plan hoping to deter people from engaging in bad behaviour. Now, the recommendations were handed down by a federal parliamentary inquiry. They're reforms that are being considered by the Morrison government, with the chairman saying there is merit to remove the veil of being anonymous. Layla?
So there we have it. They are using this app to try to stop and prevent what they are calling bad behavior, which is not exactly defined. And the question always is, who decides what this bad behavior is and how are they going to define it? And also, I see someone in the chat is complaining that I have an Apple Watch. This is not an Apple Watch. It is a Fitbit. But even if it wasn't, sorry. So here is an article out of The Guardian about this bill. Australian powers to spy on cybercrime suspects given green light. Now, the headline of this article says that it's cybercrime suspects, but we just heard the actual news clip that really it's about discouraging bad behavior on social media. So it's more than just criminals that they're looking at, or suspected or supposed criminals. They're also looking at trolls on the internet and people probably that they would say are dispersing fake news or disinformation or blah, 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 blah. So, according to The Guardian, a government bill to create new police powers to spy on criminal suspects online, disrupt their data, and take over their accounts has been passed with the support of Labor. But again, remember, this isn't just like an NSA type thing. We just heard that news clip that said that Australians will have to submit pieces of identification in order to use their social media apps under this new program. This isn't like an NSA spying in the background, sup NSA agent. This is something that Australians are going to be forced to actively participate in. Which, I mean, I suppose, depending on the way you look at it, well, at least it's not happening secretly, but this is an extreme violation of privacy, though clearly they don't care about that so much in Australia. The Identify and Disrupt bill passed the Senate on Wednesday, despite concerns about the low bar of who can authorize a warrant and that the government failed to implement all the safeguards recommended by the Bipartisan Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And you know that this bill must be bad if even The Guardian is like, oh man, wow, there's still concerns about the low bar of getting a warrant and that they didn't actually implement any of these safeguards. If The Guardian is saying it and being a little bit critical, you know it's bad, because The Guardian has been quite in favor of lockdowns and all kinds of other crazy things in the name of COVID. So, according to The Guardian, the bill creates 3 new types of warrants that enable the Australian Police and Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission to modify and delete data, take over accounts, and spy on Australians in networks suspected of committing crimes. Earlier in August, the Parliament Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, chaired by the Liberal Senator James Paterson, made a series of recommendations to improve oversight and safeguards. But of course, as The Guardian said earlier in this article, those safeguards weren't actually adopted in this bill, and it was passed anyways. One of the proposed amendments was a sunset clause so that new powers would expire after 5 years and would put in stronger criteria to issue warrants. And of course, those didn't happen. Under some other proposed amendments, the media would also gain extra protection with the addition of a public interest test for data disruption warrants, network activity warrants, and account takeover warrants where an investigation of an unauthorized disclosure offense is in relation to a person working in a professional capacity as a journalist. It's not really clear whether this part was passed in it as well. But the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor will review the bill after 3 years, and then it's going to be reviewed by another agency after 4. So they're going to implement this bill without any of the safeguards or amendments that were asked for to try to protect some minute modicum of privacy in people and actually require stricter qualifications and reasonings for a warrant. Was passed without that stuff going, and they're not going to actually review the bill and how it affects people for 3 years and the other agency for 4 years. They're just doing it anyways. And some of the things that could trigger a warrant and use of this bill would include tax offenses, trademark infringements, and a range of other offenses beyond terrorism and issues with children that we are not allowed to mention on YouTube. You know, and there's a study that came out that said on average, everybody violates 4 laws a day because there are just so many laws on the books. So it would be so easy for someone to get caught up under this bill. It's already pretty easy for people to get caught up under NSA spying. And we're not even talking about America here. We're talking about Australia, which is going all crazy and doing these insane lockdowns and sending the military out to make sure that people are actually quarantining and locking down and shooting puppies because COVID. And now they have a cybersecurity bill. Cybersecurity, quote unquote, bill where they're going to be looking at people's social media. Despite significant changes recommended by the committee, half of them were either rejected or only partially adopted. And this fellow said, it's alarming that instead of accepting the committee's recommendations and allowing time for scrutiny of subsequent amendments, the Morrison government rushed these laws through Parliament in less than 24 hours. Well, that sounds a little bit like the United States, doesn't it? While the safeguards for journalists and whistleblowers are welcome, they highlight the lack of wider entrenched safeguards for press freedom and free speech in Australia. And apparently there was something called Operation Ironside, where 290 people were arrested. And that is being used as proof that they need this bill because blah, 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 anonymous dark web. So we have another article here. This is from Tech Times. Australian government tests facial recognition application to implement during quarantine measures. And this relates to a little ditty that was talked about in The Atlantic, which says, the government of South Australia, one of the country's 6 states, developed and is now testing an app as Orwellian as any in the free world to enforce its quarantine rules. So this is an app beyond this cybersecurity program, cybersecurity quotes, air quotes, program that we just talked about. So, under this new app that the government of South Australia is developing and testing, travelers coming into Australia or between states in Australia will, of course, have to quarantine, and they will be quarantined at home. At which point they will be forced to download an app that combines facial recognition and geolocation. The state will text them at random times, and thereafter they will have 15 minutes to take a picture of their face in the location where they're supposed to be. And if they fail, the police department will follow up with them and show up at their location. The premier, which is the Australian version of a governor, they don't use the word governor there, said, we don't tell them how often or when on a random basis. They have to reply within 15 minutes. I think every South Australian should feel pretty proud that we are the national pilot for the home-based quarantine app. And here is the app on the App Store. Look at that. COVID Safe is E for everyone from the Australian Department of Health. And look at that, 4.5 stars with over 22,000 reviews. And it says, join the fight to stop the spread of COVID. You get notified quickly, supposedly, if you come into contact with someone with COVID, and your identity is safeguarded, except for, spying by the government. And it says, well, you're in control of your information. Yeah, except you have to send a picture of your face within 15 minutes when the government says, like, hey, where are you? So the description says that the app uses Bluetooth technology on your mobile phone to look for other devices that have the app installed, and your device will take note of contact you've had with other users by securely logging the other user's reference code. If you were someone you've been in contact with is diagnosed with COVID, the close contact information securely stored in your phone can be uploaded and used with your consent, they say, by state and territory health officials to quickly inform people who've been exposed to the virus. And it's got 3.5 stars, 3.5 stars. But look at all these 5-star reviews up here. And one of the issues, it's funny, there are a lot of people that actually aren't downloading this app, and it's not because of privacy concerns. It's because one of the settings requires you to turn off battery optimization, and interestingly enough, the app drains people's batteries super fast, and that is why there are some people that are rebelling against downloading it rather than because of any privacy concerns. So this one said that the app takes up 70% battery power. Another one says it takes over 30% every day. And fun stuff. So back to this Atlantic article here. It also says that before 2020, the idea of Australia all but forbidding its citizens from leaving the country, a restriction associated with communist regimes, was unthinkable. But today, it is a widely accepted policy. Australia's borders are currently closed, and international travel from Australia remains strictly controlled to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. And so here is actually from health.gov in Australia. Mandatory quarantine applies to travelers entering Australia from overseas, except if arriving from a green zone country, and green zone countries change all of the time. But states and territories have their own travel restrictions, including closing state borders and restricting travel into and out of their state, restricting travel into and out of areas within their state, and requiring people who have traveled to and from some areas to quarantine for 14 days. There's all these rules about domestic travel in Australia using this app, and it applies to not just flying, but driving between states. We also have this from another government website that I have archived. Australians and permanent residents. If you are an Australian citizen or a permanent resident, you cannot leave Australia due to COVID-19 restrictions unless you have an exemption. You have to apply online for your exemption, but to apply, you have to meet at least one of these criteria. The criteria are that your travel is part of the COVID-19 response, and including provision of aid. Your travel is essential for the conduct of critical industries and business, including export and import industries, and there is a special list relating to this. So to have this exemption, you need to be on the special list. You are traveling to receive urgent medical treatment that is not available in Australia. And coincidentally, someone sent me an article via email earlier this week. There was a case of 4 newborn babies dying because they weren't allowed to travel to go get medical care during the lockdown. They had to receive special care that was in a different state. I believe it was related to a heart issue. That story isn't brand new, actually. That was from last year. That's something that happened last year. And even though there was a bunch of people that died due to the restrictions, including 4 babies, they have implemented these same travel restrictions again. You do have an exemption if you're traveling on urgent and unavoidable personal business, but it can't be that urgent because you still need to apply online for the exemption and have your papers to actually have the exemption and travel. You are allowed to travel on compassionate or humanitarian grounds, similar to being part of the provision of aid for the COVID outbreak response, or your travel is in the national interest. Those are the only exemptions for being able to travel. And you have to support your claims with evidence if you apply for an exemption. And requests may be finalized without further consideration if insufficient evidence is provided. So, if they decide that even if you fit one of these exemptions, you don't have enough evidence to prove it, they're just going to close your claim. So you need to provide passports, you need to provide marriage certificates, birth certificates, or a death certificate if you are attending a funeral. You have to have proof of relationship if you are traveling with someone or traveling because of some relational issue. You have to have proof that you are moving to another country on a long-term basis, such as a lease and a job offer, and evidence that you are actually moving your things if your reason for leaving the country is related to moving. You have to have proof of a current valid visa, a letter from a doctor or a hospital about any medical treatment or condition, and a statement from your doctor on why that travel is necessary. So again, if you are getting urgent medical treatment that's not available in Australia, can't be that urgent because you need a doctor's note with proof on why you need to travel. And again, you need to apply for the exemption. You need a letter from an employer as to why travel is necessary, if that is your reason, and why the work that you're performing is critical. You have to have evidence of when you're coming back and any other proof that might support your claims. And everything needs to be in English. And it says you should apply for an exemption at least 2 weeks, but not more than 3 months before your planned travel. So again, if your medical care that is urgent, supposedly, is your reason for traveling. Again, it can't be that urgent because you need to give the government at least 2 weeks to process your paperwork for an exemption. This is not, I mean, in the list of restrictions and requirements just keeps on going. So this is from the Australian Government Department of Home Affairs. I'm going to jump into the super chat here before I go on and talk about some of these other things. David Neal says 15 minutes. I think I might just have to go to the bathroom and take a selfie and send it in response. Jiminica Jet says that they have bots doing the reviews on that app. I mean, and that is entirely possible. Michael J says the app should be mandated or should be rated M for mandatory. That would be pretty funny, wouldn't it? Jesse Meek says if you don't believe the Australian government, you are wrong. Just ask their Ministry of Truth. They will set you straight. It does seem to be that way, doesn't it? Especially if they're going to be spying on people's social media and going in and changing things and deleting accounts and deleting information and posts and things like that. That's really quite chilling. And Mark Fallows, thank you for the generous donation. That is very kind. Perry Stark says it should apply, not must apply 2 weeks prior. Well, see, that's the thing, is they're saying that it is mandatory. So let's go into an article about this home quarantine app here. So this is the article from the Tech Times about the facial recognition app to implement during quarantine measures. So they are testing this app that is using facial recognition for them to implement during quarantine measures. The new application is currently being tested in order to make sure that residents are following COVID-19 home quarantine orders. Oh, this is actually, I'm sorry, this is an additional app beyond the one that we were just looking at. So this is a different app. This is a contact tracing app. There's an additional app called the Home Quarantine South Australia app in app stores. Let's see if we can find this on DuckDuckGo here. Bam, let's see. Oh, it's giving us the link instead. All right, hold on. Give me 1 second to see if I can actually find this in the App Store, because that would be fun times. So there's the government website for it. Interesting. It's not coming up. Here we go. We're going to go through Google Play here. So this is the other app. This is the Home Quarantine South Australia, developed by the state government of South Australia. It's not available for my device, and I am quite okay with that. So we see we have some screenshots here where you can manage your home quarantine requirements all in one place. You can easily send daily symptom checks. You can see when your symptom checks and tests are due or completed. One-touch proof of identity and current location, notifications for reminders, and links to helpful advice, help and support during your home quarantine. Know when your home quarantine is complete. And you can also download it for a tablet. Apparently, says that this app provides the support and resources to enable eligible citizens to quarantine in their own home. Now note, because there are some people that are being required to quarantine at hotels and other places, not everyone is allowed to quarantine at home. Features include random live face check-in requests to show a real person checking in at their registered location in real time. They say this like this is a great positive thing. Schedule of required symptom checks and COVID-19 tests to help plan and manage your quarantine. Daily symptom check reminders and submission. Scheduled test reminders and indication of tests taking. Links to guidelines, and guided end of quarantine exit process. So there has to be a process that you have to follow when you're done with quarantine. You can't just be like, sweet, I'm done, and go back outside. And so this is brand new. Let's look at the permissions. So the permissions, you have to give the app access to your location, your camera, and other. So it has to be able to get Wi-Fi and internet information. It has to control vibration, so it's going to vibrate as part of its alert. View network connections. You need to give it full network access and prevent the device from sleeping. So it needs to be on and active and monitoring you 24/7, which is super duper fun. Offered by the state government of South Australia. So according to this Tech Times article and the Western Journal, apparently the app uses geolocation as well as facial recognition software in order to track those that are still in quarantine, according to the South Australia Premier and his statements to Australia's ABC in an interview that he gave last month. South Australians that are ordered to quarantine have to download the app. The app ensures that citizens comply with the quarantine orders by contacting certain people at random and asking them to provide their proof of location within just 15 minutes. Do you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when I was working at this nonprofit back in Massachusetts. It was a community nonprofit mental health center, and it served all kinds of people, including the criminologic population. I've mentioned this a few times before on the show and in videos, I think, where I worked. I had like three little subsets of clients. I had, what we call the worried well people. That was a pretty small subset in this particular clinic. I had people with severe and chronic mental illness, and then I had the criminologic population. So this is your men and women that are on probation and parole. They might have been on house arrest and had to register my office as a location they were allowed to travel at. And a lot of them were also submitted to random drug testing. And under the random drug testing, at least in this jurisdiction of Massachusetts, we had something called the color system. And so what you had to do, depending on how often you were required to report in, that determined your color, right? And what you had to do is you had to call in a phone number every day, every week, whatever it was that you were assigned. Say it was Wednesdays. Every Wednesday, you had to call in to this phone number and check to see what color was due in that day, and it was picked at random. There was purple, there was red, there was all kinds of different colors. So if you called in at, say, 7 a.m. that morning and you were a purple and you were told that purple was called, well, then you had less than 12 hours to show up at this particular location and have a drug test done. Some people only had to call in once every 2 weeks. Some people had to call in once a week. Some people had to call in 3 or 4 times a week. This reminds me of that, where they're basically checking on you at random and treating you like a criminal, like a drug addict that's on probation or parole because you happened to get sick. And you happened to get sick in a country that's locked down, and the whole purpose of the lockdowns is supposedly to stop people from getting sick and to stop this virus from existing, which is not how viruses work and is not actually working because, well, look at this. Cases rise in Victoria despite lengthy lockdown from CNN. This was only posted 2 days ago. But this app reminds me a lot of the parole and probation color system. Maybe that's where they got the idea. Citizens would also share their location with the government or even provide live face check-ins in order for them to confirm that they are at the registered quarantine address according to the description by the app. Marshall, that is the premier, told ABC that nobody tells them how often or when, and that it is on a random basis. The ones being quarantined would have to reply within 15 minutes, and not only do they have to reply within 15 minutes, they have to reply with a picture and proof that they are at the registered quarantine address. So they have to be at their home or wherever it is they were told that they had to quarantine, not outside, not at the grocery store, not at the pharmacy, not at the doctor. They have to be home. And the people that break quarantine can face fines of up to $1,000. South Australia's COVID guidelines. Health officials and law enforcement officers can also direct citizens to quarantine in their homes or even in quarantine hotels for a total of 14 days. So it's the guidelines, health officials, and law enforcement who decide that you need to randomly quarantine and go home and download this app. Individuals who also miss their geolocation check-ins will also be receiving a follow-up phone call where they can discuss why they missed the notification. So you have to have a good reason. And if they miss that phone call as well, a compliance officer would visit their home. The premier, aka governor, noted to ABC that they used the app in order to verify that people were where they should be during home-based quarantine. The application's pilot program started on August 23rd, so just a little over a week ago, and had 50 participants. But nevertheless, the premier is planning statewide adoption. And says that every single South Australian should feel proud that they are the national pilot for the new home-based quarantine app. And what's kind of funny here is this article here from The Atlantic that mentions this app was posted on Twitter. And this guy is apparently an American and not from Australia. And 99% of the responses on Twitter talked about how, well, this guy is an American and so he doesn't have a right to talk about Australia. And it was a bunch of Australians saying that they agree with these restrictions and the apps and all of those things, and that it did a damn good thing to prevent deaths and COVID spreading in Australia. And then they said that America has no room to talk because of the hot spots that we're having and the deaths that we're having. Even though we've looked at some graphs and things on the show before that talked about how the deaths and positive cases are not nearly what they were this time last year. So it is true, unfortunately, that there are a large amount of Australians that are on board with this sort of thing. There was a challenge to the COVID-19 restrictions in Australia, and the court struck it down. They said it may be accepted that the travel restrictions are harsh. It may also be accepted that they intrude upon individual rights, but Parliament was aware of that. Until last month, Australians who are residents of foreign countries were exempt from the travel restrictions, so they could return to their residence, but the government tightened the restrictions further, trapping many of them in the country as well. all kinds of crazy things. Other states have curtailed their citizens' liberty in the name of safety. The state of Victoria announced a curfew and suspended its parliament for key parts of the pandemic. So the government isn't even in office and working because COVID. To put this in context, federal and state parliaments sat during both world wars and the Spanish flu. So they are comparing a virus with a overall 99% survival rate to World War I and World War II as their reasoning for these restrictions and for temporarily disbanding Parliament in the state of Victoria in Australia. Absolutely insane. In Victoria, they also said that in responding to a question about whether he had gone too far with respect to imposing a curfew, avoiding the question of why a curfew was needed when no other state had one, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews replied, "It is not about human rights, it's about human life." I think that he does not quite understand. In New South Wales, which is, I believe, the area where that little rural community was that shot the dogs, Police Minister David Elliott defended the deployment of the Australian military to enforce lockdowns, telling the BBC that some residents of the state thought the rules didn't apply to them, and that's why they needed the military. It does remind me of when we had the National Guard in Rhode Island stopping cars and turning people away at the borders into Rhode Island. Everyone says that nothing like this could ever happen here, but it did happen here. It happened in Rhode Island. I did that video last year. You can look on my channel for it. In Sydney, where more than 5 million people have been in lockdown for more than 2 months, and Melbourne, the country's second biggest city, anti-lockdown protests were banned. They are banning protests. And when dissenters gathered anyway, hundreds were arrested and fined, according to Reuters. And also we have that here on ABC, that authorities in Australia say that more than 250 people have been arrested while protesting COVID lockdowns in the country. So there are some folks that are against some of the restrictions that are going on, but social media and the news at least makes it seem like it's not that many. And despite all this, Australia is supposedly a democracy. But if a country indefinitely forbids its own citizens from leaving its borders, strands tens of thousands of its citizens abroad, puts strict rules on interstate travel, prohibits citizens from leaving home without an excuse from an official government list, mandates masks even when people are outdoors and socially distanced, deploys the military to enforce those rules, bans protests, and arrests and fines dissenters, is that country still a liberal democracy? According to the folks over on Twitter, which I recognize don't represent the entire voting public, but according to the folks over on Twitter, well, this is democracy because this is what the Australians have asked for. Which, I mean, I guess if that's their thing, well, then it certainly is an interesting experiment in democracy, isn't it? Nomad Prospecting says that it is a democracy. It is mob rule, and that is an excellent point, as democracy is two lambs, or rather two wolves and a lamb, voting on what is for dinner. See, we have a couple more super chats that have come in. Let's see. Oh, I missed this one earlier. Trashman says, did you hear that in New Zealand, the gun ban didn't stop a knifing or the recall Newsom page at the Atlanta airport? I haven't heard anything about the recall Newsom thing. I haven't really been keeping up with the news this week because I've had company, and we mentioned that there was the stabbing spree in New Zealand. Jesse says if this whole process is this strict, you really have to wonder what is done to those that fail part of it or flat out refuse. Anyone know how many Aussies have just vanished lately? That is a good question. Bruce the Boss says, just dropping in, I'll watch replay, headed towards San Antonio First Friday costume pub run. This month's theme is anime and video games. We'll have fun with your pub run. All right, let's see. Which things have I gone through here? And which ones do we have yet to cover? Okay, so this is an article about the extension of the lockdowns in Australia. And this is from CNN. Reposted on MSN. The Australian state of Victoria has extended its lockdown for another 3 weeks after tough restrictions failed to lower the number of daily new coronavirus cases. And you know what's funny is when I was doing an internet search earlier for this story, it was really interesting because this headline popped up from CNN, and then we also had headlines from The Guardian saying, oh, well, instead of painting it as, oh, yes, the lockdowns have been extended another 3 weeks, they were like, oh, well, the lockdowns are ending in September. And they were celebrating it like, look, we have this plan now to end the lockdowns. It's great. The lockdowns are working. And that is why they're choosing to end them later this month, which I suppose is one take. It's certainly a spin, but it's interesting to see the same story being spun 2 different ways of like, oh yes, well, it was extended for 3 weeks, but that means that it's ending this month versus, yeah, it's extended for 3 weeks, even though there's still rising cases in Victoria. So this same Victorian premier, says that restrictions will only ease when 70% of eligible residents receive their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. So he is planning to keep his state in Australia held hostage, essentially, until 70% of people have taken at least one shot. They're saying that that is expected to happen around September 23rd, which is why they're extending it and saying, well, oh, we're only going to extend it for 3 weeks and then we'll quit it because they think like, okay, they're going to get to that 70% number by that time. So far, only 56% of people aged 16 and above have actually received their first dose. So they've got about 15% to go. What we must do is suppress case numbers sufficiently to buy us time to get people vaccinated. What that means is that we can't ease restrictions today in any profound way. Now, mind you, we have seen this from all kinds of outlets and from the CDC itself that the COVID vaccine does not actually stop you from getting COVID, and it doesn't actually stop transmission. So when they say that the goal is no new cases, which has been a goal in New Zealand, for example, that's not really realistic, especially when the goalpost for that is 70% vaccination rates, because that's not actually going to stop you again from catching it or spreading it. And in fact, there was a new study that came out of Israel recently that found that natural immunity lasts longer and is a lot stronger than just getting vaccinated. All of this is over 120 new cases. 3 weeks, 3 more weeks on top of the year and a half to flatten the curve, and 70% vaccination requirements because of 120 new cases. That was up from 76 on the previous day, but substantially less than the 1,116 cases recorded in the neighboring state of New South Wales, which had a total of 4 new deaths. The leaders of both states concede they will not be able to eliminate the virus and are racing to vaccinate their populations before removing most lockdown restrictions in line with the national plan, which is interesting because, yes, they are no longer saying that they're going to be able to have a zero tolerance policy. But again, other headlines about this story celebrated, oh, Australia is now looking at living with the virus rather than eradicating it, which, yes, but only because they've figured out, hopefully, finally, that lockdowns don't work and that their restrictions don't work. But hey, as a bonus, if you are vaccinated, you get to spend an extra hour outside during these lockdowns. That's one of the perks of getting an experimental vaccine is you get to have an extra hour outside. So you get 2 hours outside instead of 1. Sydney has been in lockdown for 2 months already and is entering their 3rd month. And their re-lockdown started on June 26th. And New South Wales again says that the pathway back to freedom, it's interesting how they call that the pathway back to freedom, is higher vaccination coverage. So far, there, 37% of people in the state above 16 years of age are fully vaccinated, with easing of some curbs promised once the rate hits 70 or 80%. So here, they're only in this state promising to ease some of the restrictions. They have a long way to go from 37% to 70%. And this is one of the stats that was cited by Australian folks on Twitter, saying despite the recent flare-ups, Australia has managed to keep its COVID numbers relatively low, with nearly 54,000 cases and fewer than 1,050 deaths. And they were like, oh, well, you can't even use that to compare with the U.S. because the U.S. has had so many more. Well, I would be interested. What is the population of Australia in 2021? The population of Australia, according to Worldometer, is 25 million. That is more than 300 million less than the United States. And they're like, oh, well, Australia has fewer deaths than the US, and so that's proof that our stuff is working. You can't even compare the two countries because of this insane population difference. The US has over 330 million people, and you're comparing that to 25 million. We'll round up. We'll call it 26 million. You can't compare those two using the exact numbers. That's just not how it works. But one of the other things that Australia is doing to try to combat all of this is I don't particularly want I have other sources beyond this article, but I'm showing this article because it has supposed blueprints for this quarantine camp here. So according to Gateway Pundit, the Australian government is building mandatory quarantine facilities, and officials say that the jab is the golden ticket to freedom. So this one is a couple weeks old, but They're saying that the government of Australia will be building what they call a mandatory quarantine accommodation, which is set to open its first phase in early 2022. And this will be the second such facility in the country. And when it is finished, it will be able to hold up to 3,000 people in isolation as they quarantine. And there's even supposedly a little video to go with it. And again, I'm always sort of skeptical of some of these outlets, but we have this person from Twitter that has a screenshot of a letter here. Let's see if we can get this zoomed in any bigger. It doesn't look like it. So I will read it to you guys instead. This is supposedly here on the Australian government letterhead, and it says, official letter to the resident. Dear resident, we are writing to advise you of an important project happening in Mickleham. I'm guessing that's how you say it. The Australian government is working with the Victorian government to build an accommodation facility at 135 Donnybrook Road that will be used for mandatory quarantine accommodation for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic. The facility will be called the Centre for National Resilience, Melbourne, when it opens. The center will be an important feature of the public health response to COVID-19, and its primary purpose is to enable strong infection prevention and control measures to ensure the health and safety of all Victorians. I've heard that Victoria is like the worst as far as Australian states go. The center's design will be informed by public health and infection control experts and is modeled on the Center for National Resilience Howard Springs, the quarantine center operating in the Northern Territory, which is widely acknowledged as the safest and most functional design for quarantine in Australia. The center will have dedicated on-site amenities, fancy, to support strong infection prevention and control by reducing the need for external services and staff to access the facility. Multiplex has been selected as the managing contractor for the center, and it is expected that work on site will start from early August 2021, with completion of the first 500 beds by the end of 2021. Multiplex is an established construction company that has delivered over 1,000 projects and has an outstanding track record of successfully delivering complex projects in Australia. And then it lists details about a community information session that they had at 6 p.m. on August 12th. This letter is not itself dated, which kind of always makes me a little bit suspicious. But then we do have this here from the Victoria government website. Alert, Victoria is in lockdown. See current restrictions. You know what? We'll open that and check that out in a second. So the Victorian Quarantine Hub, protecting the community from COVID-19 with a purpose-built quarantine facility. So even though we have that article from the Gateway Pundit, which a lot of people would probably dismiss, and you could argue that that letter on Twitter could be fabricated, here we have the actual government website for the state of Victoria in Australia talking about a purpose-built quarantine facility, and it has the same date of the community information session, August 12th, 6 p.m., and it's online through Eventbrite, which is a real website. I have used it. And it will explain why the project is needed, infection prevention and control measures, and the construction of the actual facility. Here is the project summary. With quarantine continuing to be a critical part of the Australian response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Victorian and Australian governments have committed to building a purpose-built quarantine accommodation hub outside Melbourne CBD to combat and protect the community from the highly infectious COVID-19 virus. And there's even a PDF that you can download of the project summary, which was put together in April. And it says this commitment followed the development of a business case by the Victorian government, which was submitted to the Australian government for approval. And it goes on and says the design of the new hub is fully formed by experts in public health and infection control and is based again on the one that's already operating in Howard Springs. And it includes dedicated on-site services, including catering. Ooh, so you might recall that there were some similar accommodations, we'll call it, that were put together in New Zealand. And I remember folks on social media being like, oh my God, this crazy thing is happening. They're having these COVID quarantine camps. And there were folks in New Zealand that were like, oh, you mean the hotel? Yes, because, okay, it gets catering. So that suddenly makes it not like a forced quarantine camp in a fancy hotel instead, because it's catered. But you get catering alongside strong infection control and prevention. The first stage, again, like it says, will have 500 beds and that it will double in capacity a short time later. And it's designed with the ability to increase to up to 3,000 beds as part of a scalable build if a larger facility is determined to be required at any point. This is not a fancy new hotel that's being built where people are going to happen to quarantine at. This is a facility specifically built by the government to quarantine 3,000 people at any given time, and it is the second such building in Australia that is being built to do this. It says, well, why do we need a quarantine hub? According to the FAQ, it says building a purpose-built accommodation hub will ensure that the highest medical grade infection prevention control practices can be built into the quarantine accommodation program and help ensure the safety of our community in the future. Now, remember from the articles about that facial recognition app, that app was for people who were allowed to quarantine at home. That means there are people that are not allowed to quarantine at home, such as that fellow that they put the warrant out for and chased down after they saw him sneezing on an elevator on his way to the hotel that he was told he was required to quarantine at. And, there's a few other questions of like, well, who will run it? What will it be called? What will it be used for after the pandemic is over? Once there's no longer a need for a dedicated quarantine accommodation hub for a COVID response, the facilities will be able to be used for other purposes. While a decision has not been made about future use, there are possibilities for the hub to be used for responses to future public health emergencies or as crisis accommodation for bushfire affected communities or other vulnerable Victorians. So they are already planning for the next public health emergency that comes after COVID. What will happen if a resident or staff member tests positive? Well, they haven't decided yet. They just know that they're building this place for people to quarantine, and they haven't decided yet what happens if you actually test positive. In the current hotel-based program, residents who are symptomatic on arrival are taken straight to a health hotel. Fancy, which is a dedicated hotel for COVID positive or symptomatic residents. So you could test positive and not have symptoms, and you still have to go to one of these facilities. If a non-symptomatic return traveler subsequently returns a positive result, they're transferred to the health hotel under strict infection prevention and control measures. And here is supposedly a picture of what that might look like. Oh, yeah. See, super fancy hotel. Look at this. They've even got Netflix. So, this is kind of funny that they're required supposedly to quarantine in this, but oh, look at this guy is sitting outside and there's someone out on the sidewalk. And this is what they're saying it's going to look like. But this isn't a quarantine camp. It's a fancy version of a hotel with Netflix and catering, and that makes it okay. So as you can see, Australia has gone completely off of their rocker. 2 Timothy 3 says, if there is a fancy oven in the camp, run. Michael Tomlinson says there are 26 million of us spread over an area bigger than the USA. There are more roos here than people. Seriously. So I'm guessing that means that you're from Australia. So, yeah, the fact that it's all spread out too also makes it really difficult to compare it to the US, especially when I haven't compared the direct numbers recently, but last I checked, New York was leading in cases and deaths. New York City was responsible for most of them in the state. You can't compare the whole of Australia to, for example, New York City. Uncle Mike says that as long as people give up their liberties during a crisis, we'll always have one, and that Hurricane Katrina, proved that. Well, things are a little bit different in Australia, but maybe not that different. Hopefully, we never find out. But on that note, we will look at real quick. This actually is completely unrelated to Australia, but I thought that it was interesting anyways. And so it'll be something to end out today's stream. This is from Newsweek, and it talks about how there is currently a trial going on through Pfizer for a daily COVID pill. And so that is currently under drug trials. So apparently we have 15, 16 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years to flatten the curve, plus 2 vaccines and multiple booster shots, and now a daily pill to flatten the curve. Pfizer is working on a pill to help fight COVID that's designed to keep people out of the hospital, and if effective, it could help reduce the strains healthcare systems have experienced over the past 18 months. So it sounds like this is an antiviral that is meant to be similar to a vaccine if it's to help fight it and keep people out of the hospital, as that's really what the vaccine was meant to do. The vaccine was meant to lower the symptoms of COVID, which essentially makes it a treatment, a preemptive treatment, I suppose you could call it, as it was never meant to actually stop the spread or stop you from catching it. Even though people don't seem to realize that or remember that, just like they don't seem to realize or remember that masks were never meant to protect you. They were there to stop you from spewing spit droplets at people while you were sick. That is also something, though, where the narrative around that has changed, at least as far as in the public eye. People forget the original reason for that, and they're forgetting the original reason for the vaccine. So cool, let's make a pill instead. On Wednesday, Pfizer announced that its first participant had entered the second of a 3-phase study of the oral antiviral that's intended to keep people who aren't at risk of developing serious illness after contracting COVID out of the hospital. So they're not at risk for developing serious illness after getting COVID anyways, but we're going to give them a daily antiviral to keep them out of the hospital when they're not actually at risk of going into it anyways, is what this article sounds like. And maybe I'm misinterpreting it. Maybe Newsweek has the information wrong, but that is what it looks like, isn't it? A similar study for people who are at an increased risk began in July. While the antiviral could mark another milestone in the pandemic, it'll likely be months before it's available to the public, which, hey, means that they're at least studying it more than they studied the vaccines initially before releasing them, right? The potential treatment is designed to be administered in 12-hour increments for 5 days in people who are symptomatic but not hospitalized. So then this isn't daily, this is twice daily. This is every 12 hours. That's twice a day, not once daily like the headline suggested. A total of 1,140 participants will be enrolled, and they'll be given either the oral antiviral or a placebo. So, I mean, at least at this point, this thing they're testing properly, which, props for that rather than just ramming it through like they did with the vaccines. And not informing participants of side effects or possible side effects, by the way, that came out at one point. The antiviral is intended to block it from replicating by taking it in conjunction with ritonavir, the antiretroviral agent often used to help treat HIV. The goal is to slow the breakdown of the oral antiviral so it can remain in the body longer and work continually to combat the virus. So again, this is a treatment. I mean, it sounds to me more promising than the vaccine at this point, honestly, especially if they're using it with a treatment that has been known to work and has shown to work. Pfizer spokesperson Jerica Pitts told Newsweek the plan is to have a readout in late 2021 of the results of phase 2 trial of people who are increased risk of developing serious illness. Based on that timeline, the readout of the phase 2 trial for how the oral antiviral works in people who are at low risk could be expected in early 2022. So this is already phase 2 of the trial, and they're expecting it to be done at the end of the year. And the low risk trial will be done by 2022. So it does sound like they're actually spending more time testing this one again than they did the vaccine. Neither of the studies involve vaccinated individuals. So look at that. All these people saying that unvaccinated folks are the devil, but look at this. Wow, they're able to participate in these clinical trials for new antiviral COVID drugs. Imagine that. If it weren't for them, they wouldn't be able to properly test this drug. But the Pfizer CEO said that combating the pandemic is likely to include both treatments and vaccines. And then it talks about the vaccine and its FDA approval, blah, 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 and the whole thing about how unvaccinated people are evil. Well, claims that the unvaccinated people are evil. Let's see. Timmer says new pill will have 99.8% efficacy. Isn't that funny? Well, gee, that would be the same survival rate as the virus, wouldn't it? Jesse Meek says we've been flattening the effing curve so long as we are stuck in a damn valley now. Yeah, pretty much. Actually, right before I logged on, I saw that Tom Woods had posted some graph. Let's see if I can find it that I thought was pretty interesting. Did he post it on Twitter? Yes, he did. Oh, he retweeted this. He had posted it directly on Facebook, but it looks like on Twitter he reposted it, or retweeted it rather. So this is something that he retweeted today. The CDC is out with more panic about pediatric hospitalizations. So once again, it's important to point out yet again the difference in hospitalization rates between 65 plus and under 18. The CDC is trying to make parents panic, and it's irresponsible and inaccurate. So it's typical CDC. So these are the hospitalizations under 18 and over 65 hospitalization rates per 100,000. And this little dip right here is when Director Walensky of the CDC said that we have the troubling rise in adolescent hospitalizations in June. Right here. So this is the line for the over 65 when we had this dip. And then this is the line for under 18, which it's hard to tell on this graph. It might have bumped up like a hair, maybe. But as we can see, it's pretty steady. I see Jesse Meek also says, hey, LD, the philosopher has a live stream at 10:30 Eastern tonight. If anyone here wants to continue the party over there when you finish tonight. And Acyclone Steve says, does this new pill have any fentanyl or oxycodone? That is an excellent question. Maybe in the placebo. Oh my goodness. Crazy times that we are living in. That is for sure. If you want to see something kind of scary, that app, that COVID safe app that we looked at earlier, well, it also has a separate website for the University of Washington, built by teams from the Paul G. Allen School and the University of Washington. It says, together we will help doctors and researchers at the University of Washington with Microsoft volunteers have built a tool to alert you about the highly relevant public health announcements, potential exposure to COVID, and to assist public health officials with contact tracing teams without, they say, compromising your personal privacy. And there is demo apps that you can download, and it's transitioning into a full-fledged open source project under the Brotman Beatty Institute. And this is a .edu website, so this is for the US. This is the US version. Washington State and Apple Google are working with our team. So there's an Australian version and there is a US version complete with little demo videos here. Oh, look, the Boston Public Health Commission is also involved. Who would have thought? So I'll put this in the chat for anyone who wants to check it out and see the US version of this app that's going around Australia. Fun times, fun times. People keep saying, well, none of this could ever happen in the US, but we have that app apparently that they're getting ready to release here. So we also have the lockdowns where they had the National Guard in Rhode Island. So we're already seeing little bits and pieces here in the US. I don't think that we will get to the point of Australia because, well, I think that we have more people here in the US that are armed, obviously, and would be willing to fight it. The attitudes between the two countries are very different in that there would be a lot of people that would support such measures here, but I don't think it would be as many people as seem to support it over in Australia. And yeah, as a final little tidbit, this granted is from Russia Today, so take that how you will. But again, it says that they're extending the lockdown in Victoria as Aussie police granted power to covertly hack citizens' phones and alter data. And it says, on the advice of Chief Health Officer, Victoria's lockdown will be extended to slow the spread. And here is a little media release about it. And here is the Guardian article that we looked at and some of the other articles here about the Identify and Disrupt bill. So that's exactly what it is. It will allow police and other law enforcement to hack people's phones and social media under that bill that, as we saw, was pushed through very quickly in under 24 hours. Q says we all have the COVID tracking built into iPhone and Android OS. Mine is turned off, if you believe that. And Leonidas Alberia says new hashtag, spread it around like COVID. Hashtag Aussie be brave, don't cave. Well, we know there are people that are protesting, but they are getting arrested in droves as protesting is now illegal in Australia. All right, so I'm going to go through and make sure that I got all of the super chats. And it looks like... Oh no, I missed a couple here from a Cyclone Steve. Says, and to think I used to like Australia, fascists. Prisoners don't make their own food. It's catered. That is a really good point. Actually, you're right. Prisoners don't make their own food unless they're one of the people that has fancy little kitchen privileges, right? Psycho's neighbor, thank you very much for the donation. Robin says Australians paying cell bills to be swatted by their own phones. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what it is. They are paying their cell phone bill and buying cell phones so that they can be swatted by the police if they happen to test positive and don't text the cops back fast enough. Man, what if you're like, I don't know, in the bathroom with like gastric distress, we'll call it, and like, I don't know, drop your phone or something or leave it in a different room. What if your phone battery dies? As we can see that one of those apps drains your phone battery ridiculously fast. There's a million possible reasons why someone might not text back within 15 minutes. Like, what if you're on the phone and like don't notice that you got a text message or something? And the fact that like, oh, if you fail, they're gonna send a police team after you. That is absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. All right, and we have, this will be the last one. Midnight Visions says, sent the paper on Dr. Robert Young and his finding of the contaminants in the 4 jabs, including graphene oxide and parasites, to your Gmail account. Thank you. It's interesting. Several people have sent me different information about contaminants in different things lately, and not just vaccines. I saw something about like a Roundup and how it's basically an antibiotic, and they're finding it in food and all of these other crazy things. John Morgan says that he just looked for the Philosopher channel, couldn't find it, thought YouTube hid it. Nope, just can't. Oh, just can't spell. Yeah, every time I put it in, they're like, oh, well, did you actually mean this? Robin says that I missed a bunch of super chats, so I don't know if those are the ones that I just got. Looks like. Because the rest of them, yep. All right, so we got them all. All right, folks. So it is 8:34. So we are going to wrap it here. Check out the new video that I posted today if you haven't checked it out yet. The next one that I'm working on, it'll be interesting. It's another indication of some of these crazy things that are happening in Australia and how they are slowly creeping in over here. Thanks to all of the folks in the chat, thanks to the mods in the chat, as well as all of the folks who contributed via Super Chat. Thank you especially to my patrons and subscribers over on Subscribestar. And I think that's it. I hope everyone has a really good Labor Day weekend. Excuse me, because that's this weekend. Oh, and Steve Pat says, can't watch the stream now, but wanted to say I hope you and Liberty family are doing well. We have not been sleeping because of having company, but they are gone now, and hopefully I'll get some sleep tomorrow and be feeling a little bit better. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in and spending part of your evening with me. Check out the new video. And I will see you next week. Oh, we got one last one. One last one coming in from Good Thankful Duck Speaker. Says, love from Canada. Send us up some of those Southern blessings. We're going to need them because most Canadians don't know who our intel agencies are. That's not great. All right, everyone, have a good weekend. Stay safe and all of that fun stuff on Labor Day. I don't know what unsafe things people might do on Labor Day, but I don't know. Be careful. Don't do it. Good night, guys. Bye.